So then when we work with the DOM and we're adding, removing or changing content on a web page, there's a couple of steps involved. Now the first step is to decide which element on the page we want to either add some content to or remove content from or change in some way, and then reach into the DOM and get a reference on that element. So that's the first step. And this action of reaching in and selecting elements is known as querying the DOM. So once we've done that first step, then we're in a position to carry out the next step, which is the part we actually do something with that element, like change its content. So for now, we're just going to focus on the first step, reaching into the DOM and getting a handle or a reference on certain elements and nodes so that we can do something with them later. First of all, let me take you to the index page and we can see a few different elements on this page. So we're going to try querying the DOM for these different elements. So we can see we have 3 p tags right here, one with a class of error. Now say for example, I want to reach in and grab this p tag right here and get a reference on that element. So the first thing we're going to do is store our reference to this element in some kind of variable. So I'm going to create a constant and I'm going to call it para for paragraph and set it equal to something. Now remember, we use the document object whenever we want to do something with the web page. So I'm going to say document first of all, then I'm going to use a method on that document object called Query Selector. So this, in my eyes, along with another Query Selector method I'll show you in a minute, is the best way to actually grab an element from the DOM or query the DOM. So all we do is place a CSS selector in here as a string to whatever element we want. Now, if you need a refresher on CSS selectors, then check out my YouTube series on CSS. I'll leave the link attached to this lecture. But essentially, if we want to grab the first p tag right here, we can just say we want p, and that is going to grab that tag. Now, what this does is it goes into the document and it goes from top to bottom and it grabs the first p tag it comes across and then it ignores the rest of them. Okay, so this is okay if you want to grab the first p tag. Now what I'm going to do is just log this to the console.log para, and save it, and let's view this. So now we can see this p tag. So now we have a reference to this paragraph tag inside this constant, and then later on we can do things with that paragraph tag, like change the style of it or delete it or change the content, etc. Okay, so imagine now we wanted to get something else. Imagine we wanted to get this p tag right here. How would we do that? Well, we can't use this selector p because that gets the first one it finds, but we can use the class selector because this has a class of error. So in CSS, the way we do that is by saying dot, because this is a class, then the class name error. So if I save this now, it's going to get a reference to that paragraph here in this thing right here, and then we'll log in that to the console. So save it and check this out in a browser, and now we can see we have this thing over here. Now what if I go to the index page and down here I add another div, give this a class of error, and then say this is another error. Now imagine I want to get this thing right here. Well, what can we use? We can't use the error class because that will just grab the first error it comes across, which is this, and ignore the rest. We can't use a div because it would come across the first div, which is right here. So we have to combine these. We want a div, which is an error. And the way we create a CSS selector for that is by saying div.error. This gets us a div with a class of error, and that's unique. There's only one div on the page with a class of error. So if we save this now and come over to the browser, we can see now we have this div. Again, if you need a refresher on CSS selectors, make sure you check out my CSS playlist on YouTube. The link is attached to this lecture. But you always have the browser to help you out if you're not sure what a selector is. You can come to the browser, and if you wanted to get a selector for something, you could right click it, inspect it, then inside the Elements tab, highlight the element you want a selector for, right click it, go to copy and go to copy selector. And that gets us a unique CSS selector for that element. So if I now go over here and paste that inside here, that would get the H1, and you can see we're looking for the body and then the first H1 child. So save it and let's go to the console and we can see we get that H1. Okay? All right then. So that is the query selector right here. Now, what if we wanted to grab multiple elements? We don't just want to go in and grab one particular p tag, for example. We want to go in and grab all of them and do something with all of them. Well, we can do that using another version of the query selector, very similar. It's called Query Selector All. So I could say const paras, plural, and set that equal to documents.query selector all. And then we pass in the CSS selector. Well, we just want the p tags. So that is going to go into the document and it's going to get a reference to all of the p tags and it's going to store it as a collection inside the paras constant. So now if I console.log paras and save this, we can see this over here and it's a node list and we can see these three different things in it, p, and p.error. So these three p tags. It's gone in, got a reference to all of those and it stored them in a single node list. Now this node list looks very much like an array, but it's not an array. We can't use all the array methods on a node list, but we can do some things with it. Like an array, we can use square bracket notation to select a single element from that node list. So for example, I could say console.log paras 0 to get the very first element, save that, and we can see the first p. If I do 2, it's going to get the third one. Remember, this is because JavaScript is 0 based. We start at 0, then 1, then 2, and we can see we get the third one right there. Okay. Now, much like an array, we can also use for each. So I could say something like paras.forEach, and then we'll take each paragraph. That's the singular. That's what I'm calling it. This is an arrow function with this parameter. So it cycles through the node list, and for each individual node, we get access to that inside the callback function. And we can just say console.log the para, and let's put our semicolons on, save it. And down here, we can see it cycles through them, and we get each one logged to the console. The last one is logged twice because we also have this down here. Okay, so we can use for each on node lists as well, which are basically just a group of elements, a group of nodes. Okay. So let's do another example. I'm going to say const errors is now equal to documents.query selector, and we want all, and then we want the errors, so .error. So anything with a class of error, that's this p tag and this div tag. So we want both of those in a node list. So let me save and save over here, and what we're going to do is log out the errors this time, save it, and preview, and now we can see we have a node list with 2 items, p.error and div.error as well. So now we've got both of those. So these two methods, query selector to get a single element and query selector all to get several elements, they, in my opinion, are the two best methods to select elements from the HTML document. But there are other ways too which can be useful at times, and we're going to have a look at those in the very next lecture.